Good Shabbos. This week's portion is Parshas Bereishis, and we once again start to read the Torah. And in this first portion, there's many important and very fascinating stories in the story of creation, but it also tells us about the beginning of civilization. And one of the stories that tells us is about Cain and Hevel, Cain and Abel. Cain and Hevel both bring offerings to God. Cain's offering is not accepted, Hevel's is. Cain gets jealous. Cain kills Hevel. God punishes Cain that he should be Nav and Nod Ba'aretz, that he should be a wanderer in the land. And on the surface, it's quite simple. Do not murder. It's one of the 10 commandments. We know murder is wrong. It's obvious to everybody. Every single society has such a rule. And it seems to be almost just the Torah telling us how civilization began and these rules were instituted. But I think there might be something more than we realize. And part of how we could understand that is to focus on one element of the story. The Torah tells us that murder is a capital punishment. If you murder someone, you get the death penalty. Here we have God as being the judge. God should make sure that Cain dies, but yet he doesn't die, at least right away. You could argue that his descendants all were destroyed in the flood, but that's hundreds of years later, and that doesn't necessarily satisfy our need for the punishment of death, which seems to be quite appropriate. Killing your brother seems to be quite obviously one of the worst sins. But when you dig down a little bit, you realize that how we define murder is not so simple. The question could be, are you allowed to make war or wage war against a nation just to expand your territory? So today, we know that international law has established that you can't make an offensive war, as Russia is doing against Ukraine. The world is up in arms. How is it possible to allow that? And we say you can't do that. The borders are drawn. This is your country. If you have a defensive war, that's one thing, but an offensive war is not allowed anymore. But as I just said, it's not allowed anymore. You go back not so long ago in history, it was allowed. That's the way the world worked. That's the way nations were created. That's the way the United States and Canada took over their territory. That's the way the nations of Europe were formed. No one's saying it's illegitimate and go back to hundreds or even thousands of years ago. You needed territory, you needed oil, you needed coal, you needed gold. Whatever you needed, you attacked, you won. You oftentimes killed the inhabitants, sometimes drove them out of their country. You established that country as your own. Your culture takes over. That's the end of it. And that's the way the world always worked. If only Cain and Hevel existed, then how do we know that Cain can't say, I'm the country of Cain, you're the country of Hevel? There's a medrash that actually tells us something similar. It says, what was the argument? It says Cain and Hevel were arguing about the Yerusha, their inheritance. Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve are the only human beings on earth. They own, therefore, by default, the whole world. And their sons, their two sons, are arguing who's going to inherit. So, in a sense, that's what countries are. It's just a writ small rather than writ large. And Cain is saying, I'm the country of Cain. I feel I should take over the territory. I need it for whatever reason. Just like countries today say they need it. That's their survival. That's how we're going to expand. That's how we're going to make sure our citizens and our children have a future. And therefore, it's mine. And I'll kill whoever gets in my way. And that's one of the possibilities, what was driving Cain. Of course, it was his jealousy of Hevel, but the jealousy might have only manifested itself in the offering, but it might have been a little deeper. And we know in history and in our own lives, we know that often brothers and sisters fight over inheritance. Hopefully they don't come to kill each other, but we know even in Jewish history, there were kings who killed their own family in order to establish themselves on the throne of their father. So what we see is that although it's quite simple, lo sirtzach, do not murder, we could define what is murder. And today in a defensive war, we say you shouldn't kill citizens, innocent citizens, only those that are soldiers. And I always ask myself, what's the difference? If a soldier is taken by his country and forced, conscripted to serve in the army, he's also innocent to a degree. Of course, he's a combatant. I understand the difference, but the line is not so simple. And we know that in World War II, for example, the United States dropped the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And although, of course, it's not so simple, the argument was it saved many lives. Those few 100,000 people terribly died, but if the war would have continued, millions would have died, and many of the American citizens would have died, and therefore there was a cost-benefit analysis, and the nuclear bomb was dropped. Again, whether right or wrong, it's something that legitimate countries, I think, make that kind of decision all the time. Whether that's allowed today under the rules of engagement is a different question. But you see that's something that could be legitimized. So therefore, how we define murder, is abortion murder? I've discussed this other times. Or is it, is uber yarachimo, is the child, the fetus, just part of the mother's body? It's not so simple. So you need either a Torah or you need society to decide and to come to a consensus. So although we think it's simple that murder is wrong for good reason, at the end of the day, it might be legitimate when there's a need, right? So you call it a defensive need before they call it offensive. We say only between countries, not between individuals. But maybe what the Torah is doing here is more than just establishing civilization in general, but rather saying we have to understand what is considered murder and what's not. Individuals killing each other, brother killing brother, is not allowed. And that might be the answers why he didn't get the death penalty. Because God never came down and said, do not kill another person. After the flood, he tells Noach and his children, Shofech Adam ba'adam dama yishafech, that when a person spills the blood of his fellow human being, he also has to be killed. He gets the death penalty. But it wasn't established before. And although you might say that's obvious, which it's not today also, many countries have outlawed the death penalty. But what's happening is Cain didn't know that. Cain rationalized it. So therefore, the Torah, God, doesn't treat him as a mazid, someone who kills intentionally, which gets the death penalty, but rather treats him like a shogeg, like an unintentional murder. And we know from later on in the Torah that an unintentional murderer, what happens to him? He goes to an Ir HaMiklat. He goes to a city of refuge. He has to leave his land. He has to leave his inheritance. He has to be a nav, a nud, ba'aretz in a way. He has to be a wanderer in the land. The punishment that Cain got was the same punishment that an unintentional murderer gets. And therefore, although you might say that there's natural law and murder is wrong, how to define it and when it's permitted and when it's forbidden maybe has to be defined by society, by countries, by the Torah, by religion. With that, in any which way that we establish laws, we need to establish it. It's not something which is so obvious. And therefore, all of morality is like that. In general, the rules make sense, but the application is not always so simple. Good Shabbos.